Welcome again to the Wednesday night Pride Perspective webinar series. Tonight we are featuring Bill's Book Club, and we're talking about the book Second Mountain by David Brooks. The summary that I found online, because I did enjoy the book about a year ago. It was on the shelves as I was purchasing commencement books, so I picked it up and enjoyed it. But the summary says, after speaking to hundreds of people from numerous walks of life, studying great works of philosophy and religion, brushing up on contemporary research in psychology and sociology, and reflecting on his own life experiences after he went through a difficult divorce, David Brooks arrived at an answer to these questions. He explains this through the metaphor of climbing two successive mountains, each of which represents a type of struggle that people tend to go through on their journeys toward finding a fulfilling life. And I think, I know the book is very on point. I think reading it in this challenging time that we have brings a whole new meaning to it. So I'm looking forward to everybody's thoughts about the book and about those topics. But Bill, we'll start with a question about thick institutions. Okay, Brooks writes about thick institutions and the role that they play in pointing us toward the second mountain. Can you talk a bit about how this relates to education, which is where we are, and Trinity-Pawling specifically? And welcome, by the way. I didn't
Sure.
introduce you. Bill Taylor, our headmaster.
Thank you, Amy. And, one of the significant benefits of having a book club entitled Bill's Book Club is that Bill gets to choose the book. So I thought about this book immediately as we began putting together this Pride Perspective series, because I think it is so relevant to the challenges that we knew we were going to be facing, we are facing as we were confronted with this pandemic, and then specifically the challenges that we face as an educational institution, as a specific school, and the relevance of this book. The question about thick institutions, before this book was even published, David Brooks wrote a column for the New York Times, which he writes twice a week for the Times. But he wrote a column maybe a couple of years ago about thick institutions and thin institutions. And obviously he was spending time writing the book, and he derived this column out of it. But in both the column and in the book, he talks about a distinctive culture that thick institutions have in common. And in the book, he says that one of those institutions for him was the summer camp that he went to, Camp Incarnation. If you've read the book, Brooks is very candid about growing up in the Jewish faith, but also attending an Episcopal summer camp, a summer camp that was run by the Diocese of Connecticut. And so he grew up with the knowledge of both his Jewish heritage, but also sort of a revelation of broad themes in Christianity. And if you've read the book, you see how those two forces really help shape what he views as the second mountain in his life. But as he reflected on Camp Incarnation and other institutions that he describes as thick, one of them, he cited the Marine Corps, for example. Talks about what they have in common: distinctive cultures, the ability to engage the whole person, head, heart, hands, and soul, that they're deliberate about how they shape their communities, and that their communities are built around collective rituals. He says that often thick institutions have experienced near failure points in their existence, and they celebrate those heroes and those forces that brought them from the brink back into a position of an ability to thrive. And that they're idiosyncratic cultures, that they have things that only happen there and can only be understood there, and sometimes language that can only be fully understood there. But for those people who are there and a part of that institution, uh, they're able to speak that language. They're able to find meaning in those idiosyncratic practices, and that they have the courage to be distinct. And I was pleased but not surprised that in the book he cited my alma mater of Kenyon College as being an example of a thick institution. But when I first read the column, what jumped out at me is just how that resonates with Trinity-Pawling, with the distinctiveness of this school's culture, the ability for us to really be holistic in our approach to education. I think the all boys aspect of Trinity-Pawling is, certainly distinctive. We're one of very few all boys boarding schools left in the United States, and that has allowed us to be distinctive. And we do have rituals that make sense here, that we repeat. Going to chapel, gathering together for meals, other than in a pandemic, but finding ways to be deliberate about bringing community together. And one of the things that that I thought we did very well during this spring term was to find a myriad of ways to bring the community together virtually. Wasn't the same, obviously, but the students, the faculty knew we were doing that, and they engaged. Not everyone engaged all the time, but they knew it was there, and that was reinforcing. And then one last point that I thought was really interesting. When I was reading this book, he talked about his experience at Camp Incarnation, and he talked about a sort of counselor that he had, and a counselor by the name of Wes Wubenhorst. And I read that, and that name jumped out at me, because in my youth group in high school, there was a counselor named Wes Wubenhorst, and it was the same one. And my parents were friends with his parents. My father was an Episcopal priest, and Wes's father was an Episcopal priest, and then Wes became an Episcopal priest. And I think when you're in that, when you are on that second mountain, a mountain that Brooks describes as being one of transcendence and one of communal transcendence, where people are coming together, then those moments of transcendence happen. And it happened for me reading the book. And just as a way to take a step back for a second, I didn't really describe what the first mountain was. The first mountain Brooks describes is the mountain of the self, the self-achievement, things that we accomplish. And the second mountain is that mountain of transcendence, how we are transformed through a greater awareness of ourself, but an awareness of ourself as it relates to others. So I know Eric Olstein is back again, our president of the Board of Trustees, but an alumnus of Trinity-Pawling, and his 3 sons graduated from Trinity-Pawling. And Eric, just curious to hear about your thoughts about Trinity-Pawling and as a thick culture, to use Brooks's terms.
Well, reading the book, I thought of Trinity-Pawling. It's when they mentioned the Marine Corps and traditions and being part of the strategic planning committee, the long range planning committee. There's always a challenge when you go through these events of challenge yourselves, no sacred cow, the jacket and tie, the sit down meals, the chapel. And my thought is, and my sons, we have a shared experience and shared values from Trinity-Pawling, because we've had sometimes the loneliness in wintertime in an all-boys school, and sometimes the uplifting event on the athletic field because we're playing athletics with probably shared competition against other schools that we like to think are competitors. That's what makes Trinity-Pawling. And I think if you took a boy and put him on any other campus, it's just any other campus with a building. And it really is, as David Brooks talked, it's sometimes shared suffering. I mean, some of Brooks's book made me think of the Exodus of Moses. I mean, they really didn't really understand what being Jewish was until they had the 10 Commandments and they went through their suffering and roaming the desert. But he also talks of suffering sometimes as that experience. And my son Ryan, when he gave a chapel talk as a prefect, and the book made me think of this, his chapel talk was about that only the people and only the students at Trinity-Pawling would understand what another person was going through at Trinity-Pawling because of that shared experience. Anyone outside, and the school did an amazing job with the production and stepping up. And I was trying to explain to my wife that only a graduate or a faculty member would really understand the significance of why stepping up for an alum is even more important than the graduation. And that's part of the thickness of the institution, that probably more seniors were probably disappointed that they couldn't physically be there for stepping up, than even more than what everyone else experiences anywhere else as a commencement. And I share that with my sons. I share that with the faculty. I share the chapel. That's what makes a Trinity-Pawling grad. That's what makes a thick institution. Whether you're in an uplifting moment or a suffering moment, you're all going through together in a very defined moment. Otherwise, it's just some other school.
You mentioned the shared suffering, and I just had an image, and this you'll remember this from your time as a student. But before we rebuilt Cluett here in the 1990s, as you will remember, at the end of the fall term, when the last day of classes in the Dan building happened, every student had to pick up their desk and put it across their back and carry it across the quad to the auditorium like they were carrying their cross, so they could take it to take their exam. That was shared suffering. So, anybody else, feel free to chime in. We have other alums or faculty.
Yeah, I just wanted to invite those who are joining us. This is the intention anyway, is to be an interactive webinar. I know it's a little bit different of a format. We're not just all listening to one person or a couple people's views. So for those of you who came in, if you feel comfortable to turn your video on and join the conversation, please do. And that's we'd love to hear your voices. Did anyone want to join in? Mrs. Berner, are you you unmuted, I see. Did you want to join in?
Oh, it's just great to be with you all. My grandson, Toby Berner, goes to Trinity-Pawling, and we've just been delighted with his growth in his personality and giving to other people and different missions that he does with his church. Yeah, so I just started reading the book. I'm about a third of the way through, and I love watching David Brooks' Channel 13 on Friday night. But this is magnificent, how he really shows what joy can be in differentiation from happiness. I found that to be really good to read.
Thank you. Yeah, his difference between, happiness is, as Bill said, the first mountain is made up of accomplishments, I think is a good, way to describe it. We all kind of go toward that one thing that we think is going to be meaningful. And a lot of times it's following up with our education. We go into a job, as they say, and think that that's going to bring us, to the height of happiness. And quite often, it doesn't, or we change course and that kind of thing. So the juxtaposition of happiness and joy is one point, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit, and maybe bring in Dutch. I see you took your mute off, and bring in what for many of us in education have come to as a second mountain kind of thing. Do you want to go into that a little bit,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things. Reading this book, a lot of pieces resonated with me. There are so many pieces. And also, I just want to say it was great seeing Toby on campus today coming to pick up his things. It was so wonderful. He and his dad were extremely proud of how quickly they packed up their room. They were incredibly efficient. It's great to see him. It was great to see all the boys coming back up just for a little bit. But I think that it's one of the missions that we have, and one of the foundational pieces of what we try and do in education and here at Trinity-Pawling, and is giving those kids the opportunity to try new things, because maybe that's the thing that they don't even think about. We have so many students who come in and they feel themselves labeled as being like, I'm in fill in the blank, I'm a this is what I am. And it's just the opportunity to try new things, to find like maybe what their passion is, that hopefully will lead to that joy later in life, that they're able to do things, not because someone expects them to do, but because it brings them inner fulfillment. And it's something I appreciate so much when I watch the kids in, areas that they wouldn't normally be in, students who have never been in a production, being in a play, trying out for the musical groups, trying out for a sport they've never tried as a ninth grader. And it's just always so uplifting to see those folks try, find success. And you hope that it leads to a passion later that they can follow.
Absolutely. Well, I would say watching Toby blossom into, Ned Reed is on the call, but he is such a talented artist. And I, just love seeing these kids grow into who they, mean to be, who they're, becoming, and young adults. And again, it's not all set in stone when they leave us, for sure, but just to see their growth is amazing. So the first mountain consists of a lot of individualism, and he talks about the price of individualistic society versus the community. I think, we're all touching on that a little bit there, but Bill, do you have more remarks to talk about the juxtaposition there?
Sure. I just want to go back and say one more thing about the joy and happiness. And Ms. Berner, I'm so glad that you brought that up. And, Toby's going to be my advisee next year, so I'm looking forward to that. And I, of course, had the opportunity to teach Teddy, and enjoyed that, having him in my class. But at our graduation, our final benediction, comes from Frederick Buechner, who at one point was the chaplain at Exeter, when Exeter had, it had sort of a regular chapel program, and I think they still do to a certain extent. But when I was thinking about how Brooks sort of delineates the difference between joy and happiness, and then I heard the benediction at our graduation, or our commencement recognition that we did on Saturday, it jumped out at me. And in part of that prayer from Buechner, it says, "Be present, especially with the young, who must choose between many voices. Help them to know how much an old world needs their youth and gladness. Help them to know that there are words of truth and healing that will never be spoken unless they speak them, and deeds of compassion and courage that will never be done unless they do them. Help them to never mistake success for victory or failure for defeat. Grant that they may never be entirely content with whatever bounty the world may bestow upon them, but that they may know that at last that they were created not for happiness, but for joy. And that joy is to them alone, who sometimes with tears in their eyes commit themselves in love to thee and to others." And, that joy, is found in relationship with others. And it is far different than just happiness. But as to sort of the freedom of self versus community, Brooks, talks about that ultimately the freedom of self is not freedom at all. It can lead to self-destruction and isolation and loneliness when we're just consumed with our own achievement and a journey that is not shared with others. And I spoke a little bit about this in my commencement remarks, that that in an American historical perspective, there's been a constant tension between the ideal of personal freedom, or the freedom of self, to use Brooks's term, and the common good or community, and that these two ideals in American history pull at each other because they coexist in our history, in our culture, but they're designed to coexist. And I think, and Brooks would sort of say, it's that tension that can pull you from the first mountain to the second. And I think one of the things that we were reminded of, we've known this already, you can see it in our philosophy statements, but we had taken it for granted. And what we took for granted was this: the knowledge that we learn best, we teach best when we are in community with one another. And we know this to be true. We've known it to be true, but we just sort of figured that was the norm. And these past 2 months have reinforced that we don't do it as well if we're not doing it as a shared experience.
Bill, can I make a comment about something that stood out to me? One of his comments made me think of the school. He said in his book, the people and institutions who leave a mark provide you with better things to love, lifting a person's vision to higher heights. And that kind of goes into that community of what I think my experience, my boys' experience, and Toby's experience, I'm sure, has been at Trinity-Pawling. I mean, the faculty are always trying to lift your vision and look at things in a different way, think things differently, and come into community with others who may see it differently also, but find a shared experience and shared common value. I mean, he talked a lot about a value system and a moral value system and many other systems. And that was just a line that stuck out to me, that related to me to the school.
Yeah, the mission of the school being the, preparing them for ever-changing world. I was thinking of that today, Eric, as we worked together on that and years ago on the new mission statement. But I don't think we all had this much of a change in mind, but we are preparing them to be ready, to be resilient, as one of Bill's favorite words, which is so true, because we can learn lots of things, but it's learning how to learn and how to pivot when we have to pivot, and how to change and grow and be better is really the ultimate goal, I think, for all of us in education. So the first mountain, they speak of, careers, and I know I graduated with a bachelor's in business administration, and here I am. Our worlds take us different places. Our journeys are different. Dutch, I know you share an experience like that with your wife, Annie. Would you like to go into a little bit of how that came about for you?
Sure. I went to college with a real clear vision of becoming a doctor like my grandfather. And that changed very rapidly while I was there. Instead of being mission driven, because it was something I thought I needed to do, while I was in school, I did a study abroad program. I got onto a 150-foot sailing research vessel and sailed around the Caribbean. And I actually just kind of found a passion that I didn't know, coming from a very landlocked state. And, immediately thought this would be what I want to do. And I didn't even know what it was or why I wanted to do it. But I think that the piece of it that I always really enjoyed is that being in that area on that boat, there was always going to be a sense of community. It was sometimes forced, but there was no other way to get around it. And so I met my wife while we were sailing too. And when we decided it was time to kind of stop, when it was time to do something else, to have a family, frankly, we started thinking, how can we take that idea of what we like so much about being on a boat, this idea of community, and transplant it into what we actually do. Because, you know, by that point, within 6 years, that was just really ingrained in us as being important. And so in looking around, and the most obvious thing was being able to work with students in a community, in a residential boarding program, which I knew nothing about. So I applied to schools, and they said I could come work for them, which was great. But it's the piece that I enjoy so much about what we do, and it's the piece that I've been missing this spring, is that idea of community, of bringing everyone together for a common goal, for a common good. And you know, it's something that's really instilled in me. It has become like a vocation, because it is what brings me what I like working with students on, you know, working with our student leaders and our proctors, and how they can help lift up those that they live with, and give back to those who had given before them, and just enjoy and being part of something that's bigger than themselves. And that was not my original career choice.
You know, I agree. I was going to be the first female CEO of AT&T. That was my goal when I went to college. And you know, we all end up different places, don't we?
But I think a better place for me.
So much.
It is something that over like a long period of time, like I can't really explain it, because you're talking to a biology teacher here, so me putting words to feelings is hard for me. But at the same time, just realizing, you know, while many days are hard, watching the growth and change in kids is something that's just brings me more joy than what I could be doing picking another profession. I mean, there's so many things in this book that really touch that, but that was one that I thought about my own journey a lot.
And for me, I came to teaching after a realization that that's how I wanted to define my vocation, because I was in divinity school, thinking, that I'd been called to some form of ministry, and it was in my second year, my end of my first year, that I decided that I think teaching and working with adolescents was really what my vocational ministry was telling me I should be doing. And so from the first day I stepped into the classroom to today, I've always sort of been aware that this is not really a career as much as it is a vocation, because before I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. Then I thought I was going to work in New York, and I was offered a job in New York, and I turned it down on the phone, and in a moment of panic decided, I'll do what every liberal arts graduate does. I'll go back to graduate school. But it was a journey. In every candidate that I've ever interviewed to be a teacher, which I've hired hundreds and hundreds of people, and so I've interviewed more than that. But every interview, I always ask the same question of anybody that's in my office, and that question is this: tell me about a teacher who made a difference in your life and why, and tell me about a teacher who didn't, and why this didn't happen. Why that connection didn't happen. And then I look at their face, and I see if their face changes in its countenance. And if their face sort of lights up in recalling that teacher, I know that person has now just moved into the next round of the interview, or perhaps that's the person I'm going to hire. But I'm going to wait and see I'm going to see how they touch their life. And if it transformed them in a way other than, well, they were just a good history teacher, but it was, and they describe the relationship as one that made a lasting impression on their life, then I know that this is a person who is looking for a vocation and not just a job. And you'd be surprised on how many people can't answer that question well, or they it takes them a long time to come up with that name. Or they try to give you an answer they think is the answer you want to hear. And so, I try to hire people who want this to be their vocation, because in boarding school, if you think this is a job, the demands are too great. You won't be effective. But if you look at this as a life vocation, where there aren't deep lines of demarcation between what your life is and what your work is, that it's all wrapped up together, those are the skills you need. That's how boarding school teachers with that type of vocation are the ones that thrive.
And I think, in terms of younger teachers, it's funny because those of you who teach here, my fourth grade math teacher was named Molly Feeney, and we now have a young math teacher whose name is Molly Feeney. So when she came and walked through the library here and I learned her name, I almost like gave her a hug, because she was that teacher to me. She was the name of my sweet fourth grade teacher. But we also try to give our younger teachers the gift of mentorship. Bill, we've been working on improving that program here and giving them, Ned has been a mentor to countless teachers in his tenure here, but we're giving it more of a formal program, because we realize that there are a lot of facets of this vocation that we don't learn in school, even if we do have, advanced degrees in education. It's more about the, the on-the-job, in the trenches kind of thing, and that does give them, I think, an advantage. McGregor Robinson.
About the importance of mentorship in getting to the second mountain.
Right. McGregor Robinson was a good friend of ours, and we have a program now that we're growing in the present and future tense to be more of a program for the kids, for the young teachers. They are kids to me now, but for the kids. But in addition, the faculty who, Ned being such a mentor with Toby, and it reaches down to the
Eric.
students as well.
And Eric, he was a mentor to me.
That's right. Ned being a mentor to generations of kids, and we thank you for that, Ned.
We had one because I got really into the book. I could see why Bill liked it, especially that quote, Bill. In the book, Brooks mentions Edmund Burke's quote, which I think is exactly what you're talking about. He says, argue that people who never look back can't look forward. I think it's kind of what you're alluding to, that you got to have some sense of looking back to look forward. It was a quote that I highlighted because not that you've ever shared that story with me, but it just seemed the way you think and the way you like to look at things. I can see why that stood out.
So these reasons and others, why you've recommended the book to the whole board, I take it, right? It's not just to us and the faculty. Eric, have you had discussions with other board members? Have there been?
Well,
I know you're a little busy these days. But.
Yeah, we have had time to discuss the book with the board. We've been very busy these days with some other outside world things taking place. But
Yeah.
I can definitely relate when why Bill would share this book. I mean, there's so many parallels to what we do at school. I did get a kick when they mentioned Kenyon, so I should have ribbed him a little bit about that. But no, I think the board, and I think most parents and most alum can relate to what he speaks about the hyper-individualism and the relationist going forward. I think that's a transformation that happens to you when you come as a student. You're somewhat hyper-individualistic because you're going there because there's something you're going there for, and it's about what you're going there for and what your parents are worried about you going there for. And at some time in that process, and during your first year, maybe halfway between, you'll be sitting at Ned Reed's table or hear Ned, remember Barbara Carlson give a chapel talk, and you realize it's not all about you, it's about everyone. And so it's that transformation that takes place at TP as a student that struck me about the book and my relationship with the school.
And one reason that I wanted to have the board read it And Amy, you're right. It hasn't been required, but maybe maybe this summer, who knows? But it's easy for schools to get trapped on the first mountain. It's tempting for schools to get trapped on the first mountain. Where schools find their value in how many of their teachers graduated from Ivy League institutions, or they find their value in the perceived depth or prestige, emphasis on perceived, of their college lists, or how many AP classes they offer, and what's their average AP scores. And those are very much first mountain type of characteristics for schools. And it's tempting for schools to define their value in those terms. I've been in board meetings, not at Trinity-Pawling, but at other schools where that's what the board is focused on. Thankfully, Eric, the Trinity-Pawling board is not focused on that. It's beyond that. But if you build schools for the first mountain, that's where the focus will be, and that's where the focus of their students will be. But you miss those opportunities to create places of transformative growth, of transcendence, of places where deep awareness of greatness that is not tied to achievement, but people able to do great things in community, or because they have a deep awareness of themselves. If you build schools for the second mountain, then you can more quickly introduce students or show students the walkway from the first mountain to the second, or that there even is a second mountain. I think schools that are on the first mountain and solely focus on it don't even understand that there is another mountain, as Brooks defines it. So that's why I wanted the board to read it.
I agree. Ned, did you have something you wanted to? You were raising your hand.
I think some of the best things this TP has done is the long-range plans or the strategic plans, bringing faculty and trustees together to reevaluate, and it always re-energizes the core values of the school and gives an opportunity to make some changes that are necessary as times change. And Eric, you remember this. Phil Smith always said, "I never want the school to get fat and happy, like rest on its laurels." And Bill, you were sort of saying that, schools that kind of look at their admissions lists and college admissions list and sit back and say, "Well, what a great job we've done." Well, we've never been a school that's been able to sit back and be fat and happy. And I guess it's kind of put us on edge for a lot of times, whether it's the fire that the school experienced, the near closing of the school in 1975, and changes that and downturns in the economy that always kept us on edge, I guess, and many sleepless nights. But it's also made us very vibrant and making adjustments when they needed to be made. So that's
great.
We can't get fat and happy.
I think too that we're if we think about what we do that's different from many other schools, I agree, Bill. A college for the sake of going to a name brand college is not necessarily a great idea for a lot of kids, not just our kids, but they do get caught up in that. And I think one way we've distinguished this and kind of made this path toward the second mountain for kids is through the practicum that you brought on board. The practicum for civic engagement, which includes a senior independent project primarily for someone to tap into a joy or a passion that they feel that they have, and they can dive in hook, line, and sinker. Or the GCC, which gives kids an opportunity to talk research among themselves an opportunity to solve a big world problem. That these take the kids out of their own, self and into the bigger world. So, you hadn't read the book when you came up with these ideas, and I think they do dovetail beautifully. Even winter projects that every student does allow them to look into interests that they might not even know that they had before. Do you want to comment about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think, I think basically, Brooks's book, is an expansion on a premise that goes back centuries, and or probably to the dawn of humanity, when people were thoughtful about their own existence. And that premise is that life's true meaning rests in the power of reflection and self-awareness, and that one's own awareness of self is necessarily deeper, richer, and more transparent when it's done in community with others, and the exponential growth that comes from relationships. So, yeah. So while those components of what became the Practicum for those were created in different iterations even before I came back to Trinity-Pawling. They were created with that foundation in mind, and wonderful educators that and educational leaders that go back decades. Now I'm drawing a blank. It wrote "The Children Are Watching," and we've referenced that in faculty meetings. That's the premise of that, of the philosophy, of the guidance that comes from, more, from educators that are looking to get beyond just the absorption of content, and how can we learn in a way that promotes self-awareness, that promotes collaboration, that builds on critical thinking, that leads towards revelation, but is done in a shared way. And if you look at the components of the Practicum, that's what they're designed to do. They're designed to sharpen critical thinking, build knowledge, but build knowledge that promotes self-awareness through community.
Mm-hmm. How can the school help parents? I know we have some parents here, and building the path, as we've talked about, between the mountains. How can we help be a partner in bettering the lives of the kids that we are entrusted to us? Do we think there's a, through the, Slade Mead just popped in. I don't know if he's got.
Yeah, hi, Amy. Your question's a good question, and I think for parents who are on this call, one of the things they need to understand, and it's a valuable tool, is that the relationships that are formed between the students and the faculty, where you have mentorships created while they're at school, they don't necessarily have to end upon graduation. And I think, and I've only been at Trinity-Pawling for a decade, but I would say there's probably 50 students who are advisees, who are still part of my advisee group, coming back asking for mentor advice. And that does differentiate us from, I'd argue, probably every public school in the country, and certainly a lot of the other boarding schools. But for parents who are listening, or that's part of the bridge, is use the faculty. I can't imagine Ned Reed's going to lose touch with the hundreds and hundreds of people that he's mentored just because he's gone into retirement. In fact, he's probably going to be busier in the next few years as people reach out to him asking for advice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So in helping parents who mean the best for their kids, we all do. We all, we all want the best for their kids. We want them to be successful. How can we help them realize that the importance of being joyful and in community might not be the most obvious answer for them? What can we collectively do to help them?
Amy, since I had 3 boys go there, I'll tell you, it's hard. Being on the board and having 3 boys there, I used to share with Arch, the former headmaster, and Bill, that a lot of times I have a lot of times I bit my tongue or bit my lip to keep my mouth shut and understand. And what I'm always reminded of is what Phil Smith told me, the headmaster before Arch, is he said, you've got to trust your faculty. There's got to be trust. So before the school can even help you, you have to have trust in the system you're putting your child in. And I know I can speak to this. I mean, relationships do last for a very long time. My parents had tremendous trust in the school and feedback from the school. And when that trust is established, that's the first way you can help your child. I mean, it's when it's trust of the teacher, when they're asking to hold the child, that's your son, accountable, it's for their benefit in the future, for the greater good of the school and their greater good, their hyper individualism on the first mountain, but also pulling them to the second mountain, because there's so many lessons that are learned. I mean, I'm writing Ned a note. I'm gonna probably have to change the note now, but I never had Ned as a art teacher. Never was able to take art from the time there the way classes did, but he was one of the most memorable teachers at school. And I'm not just saying because he's retiring. I was at his table for dinner, and it was the most greatest conversations of any table I sat at Trinity-Pawling, including instructing boys how to put remember putting napkins on your lap and elbows off the table, and why it was important to have etiquette at the table. It's that trust in the teachers, and the boys fully experience it, and getting different experiences from the faculty. And once you establish that trust, they already are helping, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I just go back to perhaps where we began with the joy and happiness, and to acknowledge that this is tough. It's really challenging because, adolescence is all about the self. That's its purpose, is in the developmental stages of life. The purpose of adolescence is to have a stage of development where the individual is beginning to see themselves and discover themselves as autonomous, as somewhat apart from their parents. They're finding their voice. I often write that this is a stage of becoming. They are becoming their own individual, and they're often crashing up against walls as they're in this process of becoming, and they make mistakes that are essential in this process of becoming. And so it's to say that that does have value. I mean, that's why this is the second mountain, because you have to get through the first mountain. But I think going back to this happiness and joy, I'm reminded of a phone call that I had with a parent years ago when I was the associate headmaster at Trinity-Pawling, and they wanted to know how their son was doing. And I said, he's coming along. And the parent would say, is he happy? And I would respond, that's a tough question. I can tell you he's not doing cartwheels in the quad every time I see him outside. And they were offended. They said, well, he should be happy. And I said, I didn't have the eloquence of Brooks to sort of lead to the joy comment, but I would say that happiness is something that evolves. And so you have to grow through the challenges of growth, and setbacks, to have a deeper awareness of a different level of happiness. And that's what he's learning. And I think I'm so grateful for the partnership we have with parents, because that dialogue is so important, where we as a school and parents as parents can hopefully be on a similar page, because when that happens, then the growth for the student is exponentially more powerful. And we at Trinity-Pawling are grateful for that partnership with the families.
Absolutely, yeah. I think boarding schools in general, but especially one with such a strong sense of community as we have, are safe places for kids to go from that place of individualism and separate from their parents, which they have to, right? But to become a successful adult, we're kind of the middle area, helping them along, helping them to create their sense of self, and then go off into the world with their wings. Dutch, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was thinking, how can you help figure out how to bridge to the second mountain? And, I was thinking about some of the things that I've worked on with some of my advisees, and we have designated time that we get to meet with all of our students, which is just truly remarkable. And I always like to ask them, what are you trying different? What are you finding different? What are you finding challenging but rewarding? And then I always, because I'm a little bit of a control freak, I'm letting you guys all in behind the curtain, but I also feel like I got to say something. But I really just try and listen and let them expound. And as they are going on, when it's something that they're truly passionate or truly finding to be interesting and joyful, to use David Brooks' word, you can just see it in their face. And then later I come back and I try to remember, and then later I try to make time. How is that going? Because they want to talk about it, and they want to have it people in their lives tell them this is a really great thing, because they think it's so great. And so, that's my one helpful hint that I've taken from my time teaching, that I'm now really trying to apply to my own children, is let them talk about the things they're passionate about, and let them expound, and then let them go forward with everything. And they'll tell you about what is possibly their second mount. They'll tell you. They want to get it out. So just listen.
Bubbling in. Well, that's terrific. Does anybody else have anything else to add? This has been a lovely discussion about this topic of joy. I'll just chime in real quickly. If the topic of joy is what you're into, the Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu is a great next step. It's phenomenal. I listened to it instead of reading it in print, but it's fabulous, and I think listening even more joyful. So the Book of Joy, I would recommend. Bill, did you have anything as last words? And I'll.
No, I just want to thank everybody, and if anybody has any suggestions for future book titles, we plan on continuing this, and finding books that will really launch to broader discussions about working with kids and adolescents and schools and so forth. So I'm certainly welcome any suggestions, but I look forward to this series continuing and through the coming months.
Great. Yes, we will continue. We're planning to continue through the summer, so come to the website. Next week, we'll be talking about inspiring creativity with our very own Ned Reed, and he will be talking about visual art, theater, music teachers, and hope to engage you in a discussion of the value of creativity, always and forever, but maybe especially in this time of challenge. Is all I'll say. So we really thank you all for joining us tonight. We you know, the hour went by quickly. Talking about books is something, you know, I love to do. So I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to help along with this. And I look forward to doing more. Thank you.
Thank you.